We are overlooking the most important thing. Most fail not because of a lack of effort. They fail because they are violently throwing themselves against an impenetrable fortress of glass and steel. Armed with nothing but obsolete weapons and desperate hope. Imagine the archetypal salesperson, a solitary warrior operating in the modern commercial arena, staring up at the monolithic structures that house the corporate giants. These sprawling enterprises represent the ultimate prize. The massive accounts that can instantly make a career, secure a legacy, and completely alter the financial trajectory of an entire life. The salesperson, driven by a fierce ambition and a crushing quota, dials the phone with blistered fingers, sends out thousands of meticulously formatted emails, and meticulously prepares glossy brochures detailing every single feature of their product. They work through the exhausted twilight and into the lonely, caffeinated hours of the early morning. They endure the numbing repetition of the cold call, their voice carrying the forced, artificial enthusiasm of a desperate actor performing to an empty theater. Yet, their supreme, agonizing effort is met with an absolute, deafening silence. The voicemails evaporate into the digital ether. The emails are violently purged by ruthless spam filters or deleted in a fraction of a second by unimpressed assistants. The beautifully printed brochures end up in recycling bins, unread and unloved. The gates of the corporate giant remain completely, mockingly sealed. The salesperson pushes even harder, increasing the volume of their outreach, believing that the sheer, overwhelming force of their persistence will eventually batter down the doors. But the silence only deepens, transforming from a mere absence of sound into a heavy, suffocating physical weight that crushes their spirit and breeds a toxic, paralyzing self-doubt. They begin to question their own worth, entirely unaware that their failure has absolutely nothing to do with their work ethic or the quality of their offering. The profound tragedy of this archetypal struggle lies in a fundamental, catastrophic misunderstanding of the target's internal reality. The salesperson operates under the dangerous illusion that the decision-makers within these massive corporations are simply waiting in their opulent offices, eagerly seeking new vendors to interrupt their day with a brilliant pitch. But the reality behind the glass walls is a scene of chaotic, desperate survival. The modern corporate executive is not hiding behind a desk out of arrogance or malice, they are literally drowning. They are the crazy busy archetype, a human being stretched to the absolute breaking point of cognitive endurance. They are suffocating under an avalanche of hundreds of unread emails, trapped in a relentless, exhausting marathon of back-to-back meetings, and burdened by the crushing, terrifying weight of impossible key performance indicators. Their attention span is not measured in minutes, but in microscopic fractions of a second. When the desperate salesperson finally manages to slip through the defensive perimeter and lands a voicemail or an email directly on this executive's desk, the message is instantly subjected to a ruthless, biological triage. The executive's exhausted, overwhelmed brain scans the communication with a singular, desperate criteria. Does this immediately solve a massive problem? Or is this just more noise? And here is where the traditional sales approach violently disintegrates. The salesperson, trained in the archaic arts of product pushing, enthusiastically launches into a detailed monologue about their company's history, their revolutionary technology, and their completely unique list of features. They speak the language of the vendor, a dialect completely foreign and deeply irritating to the crazy busy executive. To the drowning decision-maker, a list of product features is not a lifeline, it is a heavy, leaden weight of extra work. It requires them to expend precious, non-existent mental energy to translate the salesperson's features into their own business context. They simply do not have the time, the patience, or the desire to do the salesperson's job for them. The moment the executive hears the enthusiastic, polished tone of a generic pitch, their ancient survival instincts trigger an immediate psychological barricade. The communication is instantly classified as a dangerous interruption, a theft of time, and it is summarily executed. The salesperson is left staring at the phone, entirely baffled by the sudden rejection, completely blind to the fact that they have committed the ultimate corporate sin. They made themselves irrelevant. The lesson here is brutal but absolutely necessary for survival. The era of the charming, fast-talking vendor who can dazzle their way into a boardroom on sheer charisma and product knowledge is completely permanently dead. The corporate giant is a highly guarded fortress, and the old keys have all been destroyed. The agonizing realization of this death forces the archetypal salesperson into a dark night of the soul. They must confront the terrifying possibility that everything they have been taught, every script they have memorized, and every instinct they have honed is fundamentally flawed. They must completely strip away their identity as a purveyor of goods and undergo a painful, radical psychological metamorphosis. They must realize that the giant does not care about the product. The giant does not care about the service. The giant cares exclusively, obsessively, and fanatically about its own massive, bleeding problems. The giant cares about slashing operating costs by a specific, measurable percentage. The giant cares about accelerating time to market to crush a rapidly encroaching competitor. The giant cares about mitigating catastrophic risks that could obliterate their stock price. This is the only currency that possesses any value within the heavily fortified walls of the executive suite, the currency of tangible, measurable business outcomes. The salesperson must cease acting like an external vendor begging for a fraction of time and must completely reinvent themselves as an indispensable, highly specialized peer, a business consultant who possesses the exact, surgical solution to the executive's most terrifying nightmares. This monumental shift in perspective is the absolute turning point in the narrative of corporate conquest. It requires a level of empathy and analytical rigor that the amateur finds entirely exhausting. The salesperson must learn to inhabit the mind of the target, to view the world through the bloodshot, exhausted eyes of the crazy busy executive. They must understand the political landmines hidden within the corporate hierarchy, the fierce, silent battles for budget allocation, and the deeply personal, career-defining fears that keep the decision-maker staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. When the salesperson stops talking about what their product is and begins speaking exclusively about what their product does to alleviate these specific, excruciating pains, the dynamic of the interaction fundamentally alters. The impenetrable glass walls begin to shimmer, revealing microscopic cracks. The heavy, suffocating silence of the corporate void is finally broken, not by the sheer volume of the salesperson's pitch, but by the irresistible, magnetic resonance of a perfectly targeted solution. The analytical takeaway from this initial phase of the struggle is that influence in the upper echelons of business is never granted, it is meticulously, strategically engineered. The failure to penetrate large accounts is almost always a failure of relevance. When a salesperson reaches out with a generic message, hoping to cast a wide net and catch a giant by pure statistical chance, they are insulting the intelligence and the time of the person they are trying to reach. The corporate buyer is fiercely protective of their attention, and they possess a highly refined, almost supernatural radar for self-serving behavior. They can instantly detect a salesperson who is merely trying to hit a quota versus a professional who has invested the grueling, unglamorous hours to truly understand their specific industry, their unique challenges, and their strategic objectives. The transition from a nuisance to a necessity requires the complete annihilation of the ego. The salesperson must silence their desperate urge to brag about their company and must instead become a master of deeply researched, highly specific inquiry. They must demonstrate, in the very first fleeting seconds of contact, that they are a peer, an equal who has already done the heavy lifting of understanding the client's world. This is not merely a change in tactics, it is a profound, fundamental shift in commercial philosophy. It is the realization that to capture the giant, one must first learn to think, breathe, and fear exactly like the giant. As our archetypal figure absorbs this devastating and liberating truth, they wipe the slate completely clean. They abandon the endless, mindless dialing. They delete the generic email templates that have yielded nothing but misery. They step back from the front lines and retreat into the quiet, demanding sanctuary of total preparation. They realize that the war for the giant's attention will not be won on the telephone, it will be won in the silent, agonizing hours of strategic research and deep, critical thought. They are about to embark on the creation of a weapon so precise, so undeniably relevant, and so completely irresistible that the crazy busy executive will have no choice but to halt their frantic marathon and listen. This weapon is the value proposition, but not the weak, marketing-approved fluff of the past. This is a surgical instrument, forged in the fires of deep corporate intelligence, designed to pierce the thickest armor of the executive suite. The salesperson gathers their tools, their mind focused with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The random, chaotic assault has ended. The era of the highly targeted, deeply psychological campaign is about to begin. They sit before the blank page, knowing that the words they are about to construct must carry the weight of an entire enterprise, must speak the secret language of the boardroom, and must offer a promise so compelling that it instantly halts the frantic, suffocating momentum of the corporate giant. The true hunt, the intellectual and psychological siege of the massive corporate account, is finally underway. The stakes are absolute, the enemy is time itself, and the only path forward is the ruthless pursuit of undeniable, business-altering relevance. This pursuit requires an almost monastic dedication to the craft of business intelligence. The salesperson must become an investigative journalist, a corporate detective obsessed with uncovering the hidden currents of the target's industry. They must scour annual reports, dissecting the dense, bureaucratic language to extract the CEO's true strategic vision. They must monitor industry publications, tracking the tectonic shifts in market share, regulatory changes, and technological disruptions that are keeping the target's leadership awake at night. They must analyze the target's competitors, searching for vulnerabilities that their own solution could violently exploit. This is not the glamorous, adrenaline-fueled work of closing a deal. This is the quiet, exhausting, and often deeply frustrating labor of building a foundation of absolute, unshakable authority. The amateur recoils from this level of deep work, preferring the comfortable illusion of motion provided by making endless, useless phone calls. But the master embraces the research, knowing that every hour spent studying the giant's anatomy dramatically increases the lethal accuracy of their eventual strike. They begin to map the labyrinthine organizational chart of the corporate fortress, identifying not just the obvious, titular decision-makers, but the hidden influencers, the technical evaluators, and the powerful gatekeepers who quietly control access to the throne room. They realize that a giant is not a single, monolithic entity, but a complex, fragile ecosystem of competing agendas, fragile egos, and deeply entrenched political fiefdoms. To successfully navigate this treacherous terrain, the salesperson must understand the specific, highly individualized pain points of every single stakeholder involved in the buying process. The chief financial officer is agonizing over completely different metrics than the vice president of operations. Yet both must be simultaneously appeased and convinced. The salesperson's message must be a multifaceted diamond, perfectly reflecting the unique desires and alleviating the specific terrors of whoever happens to be looking at it. The magnitude of this intellectual challenge is staggering, but it is the absolute, non-negotiable price of entry into the world of massive corporate sales. The amateur gives up, retreating to the safety of selling small deals to easily accessible targets. The master, however, leans into the immense difficulty, their spirit hardened by the realization that the very complexity that repels the weak is exactly what protects the massive rewards from the unworthy. They are no longer a salesperson, they are a strategic operative preparing for a highly sophisticated, multi-tiered infiltration. The strategic operative, having completely mapped the labyrinthine political and economic topography of the massive corporate account, now retreats into the solitary, agonizing crucible of linguistic alchemy. They sit in absolute silence, staring at the vast, intimidating expanse of the blank page, fully aware that the words they are about to forge must possess the kinetic, devastating power to violently shatter the deeply entrenched apathy of the corporate giant. The amateur, driven by the frantic, unthinking desperation of a looming quota, would simply vomit a chaotic, disorganized list of product features onto the page, praying that the blind, chaotic barrage might accidentally strike a hidden nerve. But the master operative understands that the crazy busy executive is entirely, completely immune to the archaic, suffocating language of the vendor. The executive's brain is heavily fortified by a ruthless, biological spam filter, designed to instantly detect and mercilessly annihilate any communication that smells of a generic sales pitch. To bypass this impenetrable cognitive defense system, The operative must engineer a radically different, terrifyingly sharp weapon, the value proposition. This is not the weak, flowery, and utterly meaningless mission statement crafted by a disconnected marketing department. This is a brutal, uncompromising, and highly concentrated distillation of pure business value. The operative strips away every single adjective, every self-congratulatory phrase, and every technical specification, leaving nothing but the raw, pulsating, and undeniable mathematics of the proposed business outcome. They do not write about software, they write about the systematic, ruthless obliteration of operational inefficiencies. They do not pitch a consulting service, they mathematically prove a massive, guaranteed acceleration in time to market. The value proposition must be a flawless, polished mirror in which the drowning executive suddenly, miraculously sees their own salvation mathematically quantified. It must explicitly state exactly how the operative's intervention will violently decrease the massive, bleeding costs that are draining the corporation's lifeblood, or how it will aggressively, exponentially drive the revenue growth that the executive's career absolutely depends upon. The creation of this terrifyingly precise statement is an act of profound intellectual violence. A ruthless editing process where the operative murders their own ego, silencing the desperate urge to brag about their company, and instead submits completely to the absolute, unyielding tyranny of the client's most pressing, agonizing metrics. When this lethal, highly calibrated linguistic weapon is finally forged, the operative does not simply hurl it blindly into the corporate void. They understand that a single, isolated attempt to breach the fortress of the crazy busy executive is an exercise in utter, humiliating futility. The executive is surrounded by a chaotic, deafening hurricane of competing demands, and a single email or a solitary voicemail is nothing more than a microscopic, irrelevant drop of water falling into a raging, boiling ocean. To capture the giant, the operative must completely abandon the amateurish concept of the isolated cold call and orchestrate a massive, highly sophisticated, and relentlessly synchronized account entry campaign. This is a multi-tiered, psychological siege, a meticulously choreographed sequence of highly targeted communications designed to slowly, methodically, and irresistibly surround the executive's consciousness. The operative maps out a precise, multi-week timeline, plotting the exact deployment of every voicemail, every email, and every piece of physical correspondence with the cold, calculating precision of a military tactician. They do not ask for a massive, terrifying commitment of the executive's time. They do not desperately beg for an hour-long meeting to deliver a sprawling, irrelevant presentation. Instead, they deploy the psychological strategy of the small bite. Every single touchpoint in the campaign is engineered to deliver a microscopic, highly concentrated dose of profound business value in 30 seconds or less. An email contains a single, devastatingly insightful statistic regarding a hidden vulnerability in the executive's specific industry. A voicemail politely, briefly references a recently published article about a competitor's aggressive expansion, accompanied by a single, terrifyingly sharp question that proves the operative possesses a deep, peer-level understanding of the executive's strategic nightmares. This relentless, synchronized barrage of small, highly valuable bites is designed to slowly, fundamentally alter the executive's perception of the operative. At first, the communications are ignored, swallowed by the massive, chaotic noise of the executive's daily existence. But as the campaign violently, consistently persists, delivering undeniable value without ever begging for an unearned reward, the heavy, suffocating wall of corporate apathy begins to crack. The executive's subconscious mind, constantly scanning the environment for threats and lifelines, begins to recognize a pattern. They realize that this operative is not a desperate, begging vendor, but a highly disciplined, deeply knowledgeable peer who possesses a terrifyingly accurate understanding of the corporation's bleeding wounds. The operative transforms from an annoying, invisible pest into a highly intriguing, potentially indispensable source of strategic intelligence. The profound analytical takeaway embedded within this grueling, meticulous phase of the campaign is the absolute, devastating power of perceived positioning. The traditional, desperate salesperson approaches the massive corporate account from a position of profound, begging weakness. They act as a supplicant, a lowly peasant standing outside the towering gates of the castle, desperately pleading for a brief, condescending audience with the king. This deeply ingrained, psychological subservience is instantly detected by the highly attuned radar of the corporate elite, triggering an immediate, biological repulsion. Powerful, crazy busy executives do not respect, do not trust, and absolutely do not buy from individuals who project an aura of desperate neediness. The master operative, through the rigorous, uncompromising deployment of the account entry campaign, completely upends this toxic, self-defeating power dynamic, by refusing to beg, by focusing entirely on delivering highly concentrated, deeply researched business value, and by speaking the cold, unforgiving language of corporate metrics. The operative artificially, forcefully elevates their own status. They seize the high ground, positioning themselves not as a vendor seeking a transaction, but as a scarce, highly sought-after business resource evaluating a potential partnership. They project the quiet, devastating, and absolute confidence of a highly paid consultant who has already diagnosed the disease and is calmly waiting for the patient to realize they are dying. This radical, violent shift in psychological positioning is the invisible, magical key that finally unlocks the executive suite. The executive, heavily burdened by the crushing isolation of corporate leadership, is desperately, silently starving for an equal, for a peer who can look them in the eye, completely unbothered by their title, and tell them exactly how to survive the impending economic slaughter. The operative, armed with their flawless value proposition and their relentless, value-driven campaign, becomes the manifestation of that desperate, silent prayer. Yet, even the most flawlessly executed account entry campaign, armed with the most mathematically devastating value proposition, can shatter harmlessly against the impenetrable walls of the corporate fortress if it is deployed at the wrong moment in time. The master operative understands the terrifying, absolute truth of the corporate world. The status quo is a massive, unyielding, and completely paralyzing force. Corporations are giant, lumbering leviathans, heavily bound by bureaucratic inertia, terrified of risk, and deeply resistant to any form of change that is not absolutely, biologically necessary for immediate survival. If the operative attempts to introduce a massive, systemic change when the corporation is experiencing a period of relative calm and stable profitability, the executive will simply nod politely, acknowledge the theoretical value of the proposal, and immediately bury it in a deep, forgotten filing cabinet. The pain of changing the system must be perceived as significantly less than the agonizing, burning pain of remaining exactly the same. Therefore, the ultimate, lethal weapon in the master operative's arsenal is not merely what they say, but exactly, precisely when they choose to say it. The operative does not launch their campaign blindly, they crouch in the shadows, their eyes fixed on the target, patiently, ruthlessly waiting for the manifestation of the trigger event. The trigger event is the earthquake that shatters the corporate status quo. The sudden, violent rupture in the fabric of the giant's reality that instantly transforms a latent, ignorable problem into a bleeding, acute, and terrifying crisis. It is the sudden, unexpected resignation of a deeply entrenched chief executive officer. It is the shocking, violent announcement of a massive merger or a hostile acquisition. It is the catastrophic failure of a key product line, a devastating, highly publicized data breach, or the sudden, terrifying implementation of a massive new government regulation that threatens to completely obliterate the corporation's profit margins. When the trigger event detonates within the corporate ecosystem, absolute chaos reigns supreme. The deeply established political hierarchies are violently overturned, old alliances are instantly shattered, and a terrifying, suffocating vacuum of certainty is created. The crazy busy executives, previously shielded by the comfortable illusion of the status quo, are suddenly thrust into a desperate, frantic scramble for survival. They are completely disoriented, terrified of the impending fallout, and entirely open, for a very brief, highly volatile window of time, to radical, external solutions. This is the exact, microscopic fraction of a second when the master operative violently strikes. They do not wait for the dust to settle. They launch their meticulously prepared account entry campaign directly into the epicenter of the corporate explosion. Because the operative has spent weeks, or even agonizing months, mapping the organization, researching the industry, and forging their value proposition, they are uniquely, lethally positioned to capitalize on the chaos, while the amateur, lazy salespeople are just waking up to the news of the trigger event. Frantically trying to draft a generic, meaningless email, the master operative is already inside the perimeter. They reach out to the terrified executive not with a generic pitch, but with a highly specific, surgical message that explicitly, brilliantly connects the operative's solution directly to the burning, agonizing crisis created by the trigger event. They do not say they have a great software platform, they say they see the company has just acquired their largest competitor. And they know that the integration of the legacy supply chain systems is going to be a massive, bleeding nightmare that will cost them tens of millions in the next quarter. Noting they just guided a similar enterprise through this exact crisis, mitigating 90% of the projected losses, demanding that they speak immediately. The psychological impact of this perfectly timed, highly targeted strike is absolutely devastating. The executive, drowning in the chaotic, terrifying waters of the trigger event, does not see a vendor, they see a heavily armed lifeboat crashing through the waves to rescue them. The operative's deep, painstaking preparation, combined with the explosive, acute pain of the trigger event, completely bypasses the traditional, agonizingly slow corporate evaluation process. The heavy, bureaucratic doors that were previously locked from the inside are violently thrown open. The operative is ushered directly into the inner sanctum, bypassing the lower-level gatekeepers and the endless, useless committees. They are granted the ultimate, priceless prize, the undivided, highly desperate attention of the supreme decision-maker. The analytical revelation here is that the giant's invulnerability is a carefully constructed illusion. The massive corporate fortress is entirely impenetrable only when it is at peace. The master operative understands that they are not in the business of persuasion, they are in the highly specialized business of crisis capitalization. They do not try to convince a comfortable giant to change, they wait for the giant to be wounded by the unforgiving machinations of the global market. And then they arrive, completely uninvited but absolutely indispensable, holding the only tourniquet that can stop the bleeding, the discipline required to wait for the trigger event, to hold back the campaign until the exact, perfect moment of maximum vulnerability, is the ultimate separator between the impatient, starving amateur and the cold, calculating, and massively successful master of the enterprise sale. The amateur starves while aggressively attacking an unyielding stone wall. The master feasts by simply walking through the wall the exact moment the earthquake tears it completely down. As the operative secures their position within the inner sanctum, sitting across the polished mahogany table from the now fully attentive, desperate executive, the final, most intricate phase of the psychological siege begins. The operative must now navigate the highly complex, politically treacherous, and deeply paranoid reality of the executive's mind. The crazy busy decision-maker, even when faced with a catastrophic crisis, is still heavily guarded. They have been burned countless times by smooth-talking vendors who promised the world and delivered nothing but shattered budgets and broken systems. They are terrified of making a catastrophic mistake that could end their career, obliterate their carefully constructed reputation, and result in their immediate, humiliating termination. To close the massive, life-altering deal, the operative must completely, systematically dismantle this deeply ingrained, paralyzing fear of failure. They must transition from the role of the visionary consultant who diagnosed the problem to the role of the absolute, unshakable guarantor of success. They achieve this not through emotional, desperate pleading, but through the cold, relentless, and overwhelming presentation of undeniable proof. The operative deploys case studies not as marketing brochures, but as heavily researched, highly detailed legal briefs. They demonstrate exactly, step by step, how their solution was deployed in a similar, highly complex corporate environment, explicitly detailing the obstacles overcome, the specific metrics achieved, and the massive, undeniable return on investment realized. They remove all the terrifying, unknown variables from the equation, replacing the executive's paralyzing fear with the cold, comforting, and absolute certainty of a highly predictable, mathematically guaranteed business outcome, the operative weaves a seamless, heavily reinforced safety net beneath the terrified executive, proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that choosing the operative solution is not a dangerous, career-ending risk, but the only logical, highly secure, and absolutely necessary path to ultimate corporate salvation. This final, agonizingly complex phase of securing the massive commitment requires the master operative to transform from a brilliant strategist into a relentless, deeply empathetic project manager of the client's own internal anxieties. They understand that the crazy busy executive, even after acknowledging the severe bleeding and agreeing with the proposed tourniquet, is still completely paralyzed by the sheer, terrifying organizational friction required to implement a massive new solution. The executive looks down the barrel of a 6-month deployment, envisioning endless, politically charged meetings with hostile IT departments, terrified middle managers protecting their obsolete fiefdoms, and the inevitable, brutal disruptions to daily operations. This terrifying vision of internal warfare often causes the executive to retreat, choosing the slow, agonizing death of the status quo over the acute, immediate pain of systemic change. To conquer this final, massive psychological barricade, the operative must completely redefine the concept of the sale. They do not simply hand over a contract and walk away, leaving the executive to fight the internal battles alone. Instead, the operative proactively, aggressively maps out the entire implementation journey, assuming the heavy, burdensome role of the executive's personal Sherpa through the treacherous, political mountains of the corporate ecosystem. They anticipate the fierce resistance from the end users, proactively providing the executive with the exact, persuasive language and the heavily documented proof needed to crush internal dissent before it can even organize. They break the massive, terrifying project down into incredibly small, easily digestible, and completely non-threatening micro-commitments. They do not ask the executive to sign a multi-million-dollar agreement on day one. They ask for a simple, 30-minute alignment call with the specific department head who will be most threatened by the change, offering to absorb the political heat of that conversation entirely on their own shoulders. This radical, deeply empathetic approach completely disarms the executive's paralyzing fear of implementation. The operative ceases to be an external vendor attempting to extract revenue and becomes an indispensable, highly trusted extension of the executive's own leadership team. The executive realizes, with a profound, overwhelming sense of relief, that they do not have to drag this massive, heavy boulder up the mountain by themselves. The operative is already standing beside them, their hands calloused, their shoulders braced, ready to absorb the crushing weight of the execution. This is the ultimate, devastating power of true business partnership. The traditional, amateur salesperson entirely abandons the client at the exact moment the client is most terrified, the moment of implementation. The master operative, however, recognizes that the actual signing of the contract is merely a minor administrative formality. The true sale is the relentless, daily management of the client's internal political risk. By forcefully taking ownership of that risk, by systematically eliminating every single excuse for delay or retreat, the operative completely corners the executive with the absolute, undeniable logic of progress. The decision to proceed is no longer a terrifying leap of faith into the chaotic unknown. It is a carefully managed, highly predictable, and entirely safe descent down a flawlessly paved road. The operative has not merely sold a product, they have successfully sold a complete, guaranteed, and entirely painless business outcome. The massive, impenetrable corporate fortress has not been violently conquered. Its heavy, fortified gates have simply been willingly, gratefully opened from the inside by an executive who was desperately, silently starving for an absolute guarantor of their own professional survival. The analytical revelation that crystallizes from this grueling, magnificent conquest is the profound, counterintuitive truth about human motivation within massive bureaucracies. The operative discovers that the true, underlying currency of the corporate world is not money, not innovation, and not even market dominance. The absolute, supreme currency that drives every single decision at the highest levels of power is the desperate, agonizing mitigation of personal, career-ending risk. The crazy busy executive is not a bold, fearless visionary eager to gamble their entire livelihood on an untested vendor. They are a highly vulnerable, deeply terrified human being navigating a political minefield where a single misstep means immediate public execution. The amateur fails because they try to sell the dream of massive, unearned reward to a person who is entirely, biologically consumed by the terror of catastrophic loss. The master succeeds because they ruthlessly, systematically eliminate the terror. They build a psychological fortress around the executive, proving with absolute, mathematical certainty that choosing the operative solution is the single safest, most secure, and entirely risk-free decision they could possibly make. The master understands that to sell to the giant, one must completely annihilate the giant's fear. They do not sell software, they sell career insurance. They do not pitch consulting services, they deliver absolute, unshakable peace of mind to a mind that is drowning in chaos. This profound shift in perspective transforms the grueling, deeply frustrating process of enterprise sales into a high-stakes, incredibly rewarding exercise in profound human empathy and elite psychological management. The operative is no longer a beggar at the gates, they are the highly compensated, deeply respected architect of corporate salvation. The journey, however, does not end with the glorious, triumphant signing of the massive contract. The master operative, standing at the absolute pinnacle of their profession, understands that the most dangerous, highly toxic emotion in the commercial universe is the warm, comforting illusion of victory, while the amateur celebrates the closed deal, disappearing into a haze of unearned relaxation. The master immediately, ruthlessly pivots their focus to the terrifying, unforgiving reality of long-term account retention. They know that the massive corporate giant, having finally allowed the operative inside the walls, is now watching them with a cold, unforgiving, and highly skeptical eye. The giant expects failure. The giant expects the operative to transform back into a lazy, unresponsive vendor the exact second the ink dries on the agreement, to permanently secure their position, to transform the giant from a single transaction into a massive, endlessly generating engine of wealth. The operative must launch a relentless, proactive campaign of overwhelming value delivery. They do not wait for the client to complain about a problem. They anticipate the problem months in advance and present the solution before the client even realizes they are bleeding. They obsessively monitor the client's industry, constantly feeding the crazy busy executive highly curated, intensely valuable strategic intelligence that has absolutely nothing to do with the operative's product, but everything to do with the executive's personal success. This relentless, unyielding commitment to the client's absolute victory entirely redefines the relationship. The operative ceases to be a line item on the corporate budget and becomes a deeply embedded, completely indispensable organ within the giant's own anatomy. The giant cannot cut the operative without violently, fatally bleeding itself. This total, absolute integration into the fabric of the massive account yields the ultimate, most heavily guarded prize of the enterprise sales world, the referral network of the corporate elite. The crazy busy executive, having finally experienced the profound, terrifyingly rare reality of a vendor who actually delivers on their promises, who actually mitigates their personal risk, and who relentlessly fights for their success, becomes a fanatical, unstoppable evangelist for the operative. The executive sits in highly exclusive, closed-door industry forums, surrounded by other deeply terrified, drowning peers, and they actively, aggressively drag the operative into the conversation. The operative no longer has to cold call the impenetrable fortresses. The drawbridges are proactively lowered for them by the most powerful, highly respected voices in the industry. The agonizing, brutal war of attrition that defined the operative's early career is entirely replaced by a massive, endlessly expanding empire of pre-sold, highly lucrative opportunities. The operative has completely transcended the desperate, begging existence of the salesperson and has ascended to the rarefied, heavily guarded realm of the trusted advisor. They walk through the corridors of power not as an outsider hoping for a scrap of attention, but as an equal, a peer, a recognized master of the corporate game. The initial, terrifying silence that once crushed their spirit has been completely, permanently replaced by the deafening, continuous roar of overwhelming, undeniable commercial success. They have cracked the absolute, ultimate code of the corporate Leviathan, not by yelling louder, but by thinking deeper, researching harder, and executing with a cold, terrifying, and profoundly empathetic precision. The core message and ultimate, undeniable, meaning that this profound exploration intends to permanently brand onto the consciousness of the reader, is that the massive, impenetrable corporate giants are not conquered by force, but by a radical, uncompromising shift in strategic empathy. It demands the absolute annihilation of the salesperson's ego and the complete, religious submission to the frantic, terrified reality of the crazy busy decision-maker. To sell to the giant, you must entirely stop selling your product, and start obsessively, ruthlessly solving their most agonizing, career-threatening business problems. It is a grueling, unforgiving path that requires deep research, flawless execution, and the courage to walk away from the chaotic noise of amateur tactics. But it is the only path that leads to the absolute summit of commercial power. Your relevance is the only key that will ever unlock the doors of the corporate giant.